One of the common questions I receive from woodlot owners during summer months has to do with the health of their trees. Usually they're inquiring about a discoloration of the foliage, lack of foliage, or chewed up leaves. Generally, the cause of the symptoms they describe can be traced directly to a particular disease or insect. In order to make a positive identification, scientists, using labs like this one, will conduct a series of tests. With the results, they can usually recommend a course of action to the landowner. In many cases, it's too late to do anything at this stage, as most of the damage has been done. Protection of the woodlot from diseases and insects is an important job, and with a few pointers, you can learn to recognize the early stages of problems which are starting to develop in the woodlot. Ron Locke is a forester with a marketing and management cooperative. We spent some time with him in the Yankee Woodlot. As we walked along, he pointed out general characteristics we can check on a regular basis in order to have an idea of the overall health and condition of our woodlot.
Ron, what should a woodlot owner look for in his woodlot to decide whether it's healthy?
Well, I think insect, disease, soils, whether it's well-drained soil, if you're standing up to your ankles in water while you know you've got a poorly drained site and therefore not a very good growing condition for most species of trees and vegetation. I think it's important to just take a look frequently over the lot to get a handle on all the different aspects to see, you know, whether you do indeed have a problem or not, whether it's generally, you know, a good growing lot or poor. Now, one might look at, well, here's a red oak and a white birch down below.
Both of them dead?
First impression would be maybe some kind of an insect or disease problem.
Sure, yeah.
But in fact, what occurred here with this heavy bulldozing and manufacturing this road and probably a yard here to put timber in was a combination of skinning those roots with the bulldozer blade and also filling in around the root system, causing the roots to have difficulty breathing, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Now, skinning, you barked up the tree. There's one example right there.
Very good example, Bud. Let me show you here. Couple of things. Again, when they came down through and sliced this road out with a bulldozer, why, they cut off a substantial part of the root system, so that didn't help its vigor any. And then, of course, right here, the bark was scun. Now, whether it was a bulldozer blade or whether they tried to get around the corner with a twitch of logs, I don't know. But the fact is, it reduced this tree from a veneer product grade worth $80, $85 a thousand or more in stumpage down to maybe pulpwood grade, or maybe fuelwood.
So some mechanical damage here killed the tree, and not only that, but reduced the product value.
Yeah, and then after that, you have insect and disease that will infest the tree, but that's a secondary characteristic. The damage was done by the bulldozing and filling and affecting the root systems.
Mechanical damage first and insects and disease later.
That's
now,
right.
Is that the same case with these other two trees, the oak and the birch?
I think so, yes. I don't see any evidence offhand of anything other than the fact that there was too much fill around the root systems and they actually damaged the root systems in their bulldozing.
So when we look at a stand, and this one we can say is what, an oak birch stand?
Right.
And we see a dead tree or something that looks unhealthy, we better look a little further before we make a quick judgment.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, what you first see. And the other factor is, too, if generally, if it's an insect infestation, you're not just going to find one tree here and one tree there affected. It may be affecting numerous trees within a stand, within a
These are single isolated trees.
That's right.
Now,
so there's another hint or another piece of evidence that is helpful.
We've got another white pine stand that's going to show us something else about the health of the forest.
Yeah, right
Shall
up
we look
here.
at that?
Yeah, that'll give us another example of what to look for.
Is this healthy? All this
Generally, this is a very healthy stand.
And yet we've got some dead trees right here.
Well, the fact is, when this first seeded in, it was just like hair on a dog's back. Very, very thick. And, of course, they fought for survival of the fittest, and these two little fellas lost out in the battle, which really isn't a bad act. Of course, what man tries to do, or maybe should be trying to do, is to get in there and salvage some of these trees maybe before they die and affect the thinning, convert growth to your better trees, and get them into the marketplace.
Now, are the surviving trees healthy? Would you say the surviving trees?
Generally, yes. We've got a couple of problems here. We've got white pine blister rust in that pine in the background there. This is a disease, a fungus that fortunately does not travel from pine to pine. It goes 1 year of its 2-year life cycle as white pine, and then to gooseberry and currants, commonly referred to as ribes. And it'll come in on a live needle and gradually work toward the main stem, and then gradually develop a constriction around or a canker around the tree, and 20, 25 years will kill the tree. So there's no real urgency there, no reason to panic. Again, with a good road system and frequent cuttings, first of all inspections and then cuttings, you can take advantage of those losses before it goes beyond merchantability.
Let's take a look at this individual tree right over here.
Well, I think right here, Bud, this is a real good example, I think, of, now, first of all, we've got a stand here that, again, came up very thick. Has received very little thinning. We've got some tremendous growth here, and you don't have to cut the tree down and analyze growth rings to determine that. The fact is, when this tree was this high, in 1 year's growth, it grew from here to here. And it did this consistently all the way up the tree. So the fact that it did this in an overstock situation indicates that we do indeed have a great deal of productivity potential in this site.
And you know that this happened in 1 year because of the ring of branches.
That's right. From one whorl to the next whorl is 1 year's growth.
And as we look up the tree, we see that they're still quite a long ways apart all the way up through.
Distance all the way up through, yeah. So that's another characteristic that displays on a casual basis roughly what you've got, you know, whether this is a good lot or a poor lot, or good growing conditions or poor growing conditions.
Now,
also, another point, too, is the bark characteristics on a good, healthy tree and young growth, and this stand is probably about 50, 55 years old. You see this bark is rather coarse, ridgy, kind of, sort of callous. That to me indicates that with proper thinning it would have done a lot better. The bark would have been a lot smoother and just look more vigorous.
So in white pine, smooth bark is a pretty good indication of faster growth?
That's right, particularly in the younger trees. Of course, old growth bark, you know, they just get thick-skinned as they get older.
So we've had soils as an indication of the health. Good soils mean good health. Yeah. The growth is an indication of that. Foliage you mentioned.
Well, I don't know that I did get into foliage. I think the fact that it's consistently a fairly dark green, I think is important. If you were to stand under a tree and look up through and you see sort of a yellowish hue, or you can see the sky through it easily, this to me indicates that you don't have a very vigorous or healthy condition.
How about the crowns of these trees?
Well, again, because they've grown up so thick and haven't received timely thinning, those crowns are quite shallow. They're not very wide nor very deep. But still, in spite of that, by golly, they've done well only because we've got a darn good soil here. Other soil conditions, less productive sites, why, we'd have an entirely different situation here. These trees would be just gasping for life.
So would another general rule be that small crowns mean less healthy and big crowns more healthy?
And another fact, too, is small crowns also mean small root systems, correspondingly small root systems. And therefore, when you go to thin, to convert your growth to better trees, optimize your growth, why, you can have some blowdown from high winds that one has to be careful of. So
So-
again, the whole concept is to, if you had an opportunity to get at this pine when it was 15, 20 years old, and you thin it to bush out those tops and then push them. In other words, grow them just as fast as you can and do a little pruning and so forth along the way. That's the way to do it. But you have to deal with what you have.
So we got a good healthy stand here and some pretty good characteristics. Now I think you told me you had another stand over the other way that wasn't quite so healthy and didn't look this good.
Yes.
Why don't
do.
we-
That's
let's go take a
good
look at that.
contrast, I think. Yes.
Let's go take a look at it. Well, Ron, this site here isn't quite as good, is it?
No, this soil, again, back to the subject of soils, is rather poorly drained compared to the upland slope of the sandy loam, a very productive site. So
Now,
this,
brought about some unhealthy conditions.
that's right, yes.
Let's see if we can point out a few of those.
Well, I think for one thing, Bud, you have a lot more root exposure. In other words, when you see a lot of root mass above the ground, that's indicative of a shallow soil.
So we got some right over there, those big bulgy roots
Root
sticking out.
development is severely restricted here, and therefore that's going to show in the crown development and the general health of the tree. Now you see out through there, it's kind of like jackstraws. And again, it's fought itself out of a thicket. And again, came in, to use the term, like hair on a dog's back, and has been fighting for survival ever since. The only thing here, when it's starting with a less than productive soil, some of the species have a tougher fight. And oftentimes you'll end up with an understocked situation.
Here's an unhealthy stand, fairly unhealthy. What would be a management prescription? What would be some suggestions of things to do to bring it back to health?
Well, I think we could certainly favor the white ash along the edge here. We've got some oak scattered through that doesn't look too bad. The pine is looking pretty good. I think 2 or 3 cuts over the next 15 to 20 years. Light cuts, because again, it would be, if you open it up too hard, too fast, you're going to have a lot of blowdown because of this wet site. So that would be my prescription over the next 15 years. Frequent light cuttings to develop the crowns and therefore the root systems to take better advantage of the soils that are here.
Forest fire protection is another important consideration for woodlot owners. Roger Milligan is a regional forest ranger with the Maine Forest Service, and we talked with him about forest fire prevention in the woodlot. Roger, what can a woodland owner do to prevent forest fires?
I think probably the first thing they could do start by managing their woodlot, keeping it clean, accumulation of dead trees, older stuff, off the woodlot. That cuts the hazard down a lot. Probably next thing is observe any of the fire prevention laws that apply to woodlands, which would be use of machinery, chainsaws, skidders, tractors on his woodlot. There's a spark arrestor law that requires spark arresters on all equipment used in the woods. And from our records, probably it's not a large percentage of fires that do start from woods equipment, but a large percentage of the serious fires do because of the type area they're in. Especially if he has contractors or small jobbers or contractors working his lot, is to make sure they do abide with the laws and write that into his contract or keep track of his operation so that he does know what's going on. Maybe a few other things would be to know the local forest ranger or the local town warden responsible for fire protection in that area. He could get the name of the local forest ranger, and if he wanted, request a visit. They'd be more than glad to look his woodlot over, give him their idea on what he might be able to do as far as fire breaks, fire lines, or digging water holes for a water supply in case of fires.
So the ranger would come out and visit a woodlot owner and tell him what might be done?
Yes, they do that anytime on request. A lot of this is not done unless it's a request, especially on small or private woodlots. The forest ranger's general duties more or less consist of checking out the equipment to see that it meets state laws, regulations, and the slash laws along the public ways and the public roads. But he'd be more than willing to come in and give the woodlot owner further assistance anytime they requested it.
If a woodlot owner were to buy some equipment for himself for fire protection, what would you suggest he buy?
Well, of course, that depends on the size of his woodlot and the type of growth or fuel conditions that he's involved with. He may be in an area where there's really no great hazard or threat from forest fire. If he was going to furnish some equipment on his own, which we advise to all woods operators, enough equipment to put out small fires that might start in their operation from any cause. That could consist of anything from a shovel and a pail to a portable pump and some hose or more equipment.
Are your rangers able to advise them on what kind of equipment to buy?
Anytime. Yes, we do that, and we work a lot, especially with the larger landowners, in purchasing equipment and recommending the type and amount of equipment they have on jobs and in their woods operations. We do the same thing with the small woodlot owners that was willing to do that.
One suggestion you'll receive from the local ranger concerning forest fire protection is that your woodlot have good access with well-designed roads and trails. Joel Swanton is a land management assistance forester with the St. Regis Paper Company, and we talked to him about the planning and construction of roads and trails in the Yankee Woodlot.
This kind of country and this road here would be very pleasing for any woodlot owner to have. There's moss in the ground, wildflowers and small trees. It really looks pretty.
There's good access here, Bud. It's a well-drained road. It's been established for quite a while. Someone had foresight enough to spend a little time and money on it several years ago, and now there's a good permanent road base here that anybody can keep maintained fairly easily.
How does a person start if he wants to end up with this? Where does he start, and how does he go through that planning process?
Well, the basis of the process would be to determine the need for the access. Most people, when they look at their ownership, have got an objective in mind. If it's for growing timber, then probably the primary need for the access is to harvest or bring out your harvested product. In addition, you're going to want road access for fire control and for recreational purposes, hunting and fishing, that type of thing. Once you know your primary needs for the road, the best bet is to have a copy of an aerial photograph of your land so you can get a good overall view.
You've got one right here.
Yeah, this is a lot we've been looking at recently, and the ownership is delineated on the photograph. In the case of an existing road, it's fairly visible. In the case of new construction, you can easily mark where you feel your road would best access the most of the land.
So in terms of what to do, you look at a map, you develop an objective, and then you put some marks on a photograph from what you think would be a good location.
Based on the topography and apparent drainage and ground cover.
You come out on the ground and check that out.
Yeah, we'll walk the projected location of the road, determine if the drainage and the soil conditions in the area are suitable for the type of road we want to put in. If there are any variations, we can amend the photograph there to determine where we should go. Once you've got your objective for your access decided, you should check with your local zoning laws. In an unorganized town, it'd be the Land Use Regulation Commission. In an organized town, it'd be your local zoning officials, to determine if any of the area that you plan on working in is within a restricted zone of some sort. That should be done prior to any work at all on the road, any physical work.
Now we're at the point where we're ready to do construction. The thing to do is just go out and hire a bulldozer to do it?
Well, you've got a lot of alternatives there. Once your right-of-way is prepared and the merchantable material is removed from it, possibly your logging contractor has already done this for you. Many of the contractors that are in logging have got their own road construction machinery. They're capable of doing a very good job on construction, and they may well do that for a variation in the stumpage price. You could hire them on a per-foot basis if you wanted the road built as a separate entity. If your logging contractor that you have in mind doesn't have the capability to build, there are general contractors in most areas that specialize in road construction. And talking with several of them, you'll get ideas and cost estimates of what it might cost you to do it.
Would you also mark the trails that lead into your main road?
As you're operating the land, definitely recommend laying out where your skid trails are going to be in the different operating areas. Very often, a well-traveled skid trail can serve as a secondary road or a spur. If they're widened out a little bit, it can provide access for a smaller truck to get in to the back portion of a lot without doing any major work to build a road up. In addition, you've got access throughout all your land for, again, for fire control or just for walking if that's what you'd like.
I'm a woodlot owner doing my own harvesting. Do I have to go through this same process?
Well, I'd recommend going through it no matter whether you're going to harvest it yourself or have someone else do it. A road is a permanent access into a piece of property, and once it's in place, you're probably not going to want to change it. If it's not well planned and well thought out, if it's in the wrong place, it'll come back to haunt you in years to come.
Where shouldn't I build a road?
There's a list of avoidances that we usually go by. We try to avoid wet areas or areas of poor drainage. Try to avoid rocky areas, areas of steep topography that are extremely hard to work in. As much as possible, try to avoid curves in the road. You can't avoid them, but you can minimize them. And again, as much as possible, try to avoid sharp grades. Generally, an adverse grade, say for a loaded truck, in a very short run can be fairly steep, but over a long period, that can slow the hauling down.
So stay away from the swamps, the steep slopes, the mountain tops, those kind of things. Now, certainly you're going to get into some places where there is water, and we're going to have to think about drainage.
Drainage is probably one of the most important aspects of road construction. When you're going through an area that has no man-made features in it, you place a road in it, you're essentially making a dam for any water that's crossing that area. In addition to stopping up the groundwater movement, you're also creating an avenue for runoff of water that hits the road surface. So planning for your drainage is one of the primary considerations in designing the road. You don't want to interrupt the flow of water.
So every road will need a ditch, some kind of drainage along it?
A road should be ditched on both sides to provide drainage, to keep the road dry in the center, because that's your bearing surfaces for your loads. In addition, you'll have to place culverts or some method of cross drainage for water to travel under or through the road.
I've found that maybe getting that road up a little higher than the area right around it helps that drainage a great deal.
Right. If your road base is 12 to 18 inches higher at a minimum than the bottom of the ditch, any water that builds up in that road base will tend to drain out towards the bottom of the ditch and then run off down through your culvert system. Again, the base of the road is the bearing surface, and when it's wet, it's not very strong. When it's dry, it'll support a lot of weight. That's the important consideration.
Now, culverts, we just mentioned culverts. In terms of metal, that might be a fairly big expense for a woodlot owner. Is there some other way he can have a culvert or a drainage structure?
Yes, many of the older culverts in some of the older roads are made out of wood, either a large hollow log, a large hardwood that's hollowed out, or hemlock in very many cases, and placed in the proper position that can handle fairly adequate drainage. In a case where you need something a little bit larger, 2 trees laid side by side with some planking nailed over the top of them will make quite a substantial culvert. Again, they may not last as long as metal, but if properly maintained, they'll last for quite a while.
And more inexpensive to start with.
Much less expensive, and usually the landowner can do that sort of thing himself with material he's got on his own land right there.
Now, we've got the road built, we've got some drainage in it. Do we do something else?
Depending upon what season you want to have access to your land in, if you're looking for all year-round access, you're probably going to want to put a gravel surface on the road unless you're lucky enough to have a lot of gravel in the parent material. This would mean a coat of at least 6 to 8 inches of good, sharp-angled gravel if you've got access to it. It's not primarily to hold the traffic, but rather to protect the road base and give you a traveling surface. If you're only going to use the road in the wintertime and don't intend to use it during the wetter times of the year, very often the parent material or the road base itself is sufficient to hold the loaded vehicles.
Now, how about seeding in on those slopes and banks of the road afterwards?
Just after construction, you've got a lot of exposed mineral soil. And particularly on a steeper grade, this can cause quite a bit of problems with erosion as rain comes down. The first year after construction is probably the most tender, as rain takes away some of the mineral soil. Any place where you've got flowing water on a regular basis or a steep side slope that you've cut into to build the road should be hayed or seeded down in order to provide some kind of a ground cover to protect protect the mineral soil in that area.
Now, I believe we have some recommendations on what we don't necessarily, there are certain things that do this very well. We can find those recommendations from various agencies.
Soil
can't we?
Conservation Service is an excellent source of material of that nature, and the U.S. Forest Service has a publication, Permanent Roads for Better Woodlot Management, and both of those sources will give you a great deal of information as to drainage and road construction of all
And
types.
some benefit to wildlife over the term with grasses and things.
So you naturally create an edge effect when you have an opening in a forest, and a road is an opening. So wildlife likes roads very much because a lot of young growth will come in and they've got things to feed on. So you'll automatically bring in more wildlife.
So in just a few years, we'll have a road like this one with grassed in and some moss and flowers. We'd be able to walk down it and admire the thing. And
Very hopefully.
good place to go cross-country skiing.
Great place for it. You couldn't ask for anything better.
That's our program on woodlot health and access. We'll see you next time in the Yankee Woodlot.
Yankee Woodlot was produced by the Maine Public Broadcasting Network, which is solely responsible for its content, and was made possible in part by a grant from International Paper Company.